Welcome to the Haunted Brew. Grab your favorite blend of coffee or tea and pull up a comfy chair for some unexplainable and unsettling stories. Ones that may leave you intrigued or sleeping with the light on tonight. I find it interesting, the way humans long for the sanctuary of their homes until government mandates it. I didn't fight isolation, although I argued the basis for it. As I lay in my briar patch, having watched all true crime mysteries in the view queue, and somewhat disturbed by the well-nourished divot in my easy chair, I decided I wanted to be outdoors for a few days. I needed to separate myself from the incessant political bickering and the blithering media updates. Fortunately for Idahoans, our governor decided against directing a state filled with concealed weapon permittees to remain indoors. We're allowed to recreate within a reasonable distance from our residence. Reasonable. So Lena and I purchased a 6-person tent, 8 persons in an emergency, and with it the idea of creating a temporary home in the vast open country was born. Whereas this desolate, cold desert, distinguished by sage and juniper, presses upon its visitors a grave sense of abandonment, it is as equally freeing. The sky would have been perfectly clear last Friday, if not for the farmers burning their fields. The forecast predicted steady winds by late afternoon, but the air was still when we slowly pulled onto the unpainted country road that dissects the tiny establishment of our town. Earlier last week, I had to drive a handful of hours to Boise in order to retrieve an equipment trailer from one of our wireless towers. When I arrived, the trailer was gone. I called my supervisor and informed him that I had chains and a trailer hitch, but nothing to tow. He was apologetic, and he told me that the trailer may have been moved to a different location. It had, in fact, been relocated to a spot which is about 20 minutes from my house. The next day, Tuesday, I drove back to Boise with the trailer and loaded a trencher to haul back. After about 16 hours on the road, Lena offered to drive, and I didn't argue. Less than an hour from home, the scenery unfolds into a barren wilderness dominated by a series of volcanic buttes jutting up through the Earth's crust. The surreal landscape is home to many desert species such as coyote, antelope, and red-tailed hawks. Light pollution is nearly non-existent, and, in the absence of a moon, a dome of stardust forms over the lone camper. Having Lena drive was supposed to allow me to relax, and it might have if she didn't feel a need to prove she can off-road. We navigated some 2 tracks that were rated for ATV use. Getting out of the truck to clear large rocks from the road brought back good memories. We crested Cedar Butte and dropped onto the slope that faces Big Southern Butte, scouting for potential dispersed campsites. We drove for a few hours, crawling across this remote plain and the volcanic rock that peppers its roads. The day grew hotter and longer, and the short legs of our little dog Lola began to tremble as she fought for balance, perched upon the center console of the truck. On the east side of the Big Butte, we found ourselves in a standoff with range cattle. For every 3 cows that bolted from the road, one would hold his or her ground. Their faces had so much character, I decided to give each one a voice. A teenage calf might have a voice that cracked when it announced, "I'm not scared of you." A large mama cow with a calf in tow might have a husky voice, kind of like Marge's twin sisters on The Simpsons. She might just convey her disapproval with a lingering as she ambled from the roadway. And eventually there were 3 moderately sized bulls blocking our path. I just looked out the window and watched the cattle gather back onto the road behind us. The smoke and dusty haze darkened the skies ever so slightly as we made a counterclockwise loop around the Big Southern Butte. I checked the recreational map book for Idaho, but the roads through this desert aren't considered well-traveled, and few even make it into any publication. I studied the topography and told Lena I thought there might be an old hunter's camp over the next ridge. At the throat of the canyon, Lena stopped the truck and gazed up a very steep incline where a narrow, overgrown 2-track threaded its way towards the top. As I debated whether the uneven plateau, high above where we sat idling, was even worth the attempt, Lena clicked on the four-wheel drive and turned onto the road. Against my better judgment, I didn't protest. As the road became steeper, rockier, and undeniably more dangerous, Lena accelerated. I don't believe her increase in speed was intentionally reckless, but I do, however, believe the weight of her decision became extremely obvious at a point of no return. Rather than prolong this terrifying ascent, Lena just wanted it to end. The truck hit, chunked, and bounced over the terrain. Ever the conscientious driver, Lena gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2 and jammed the accelerator to get the right side tires out of a deep rut. I don't want to get high-centered, she mumbled. Apparently, she didn't want to drive over any sage either, because when I pointed out the last and only clearing to turn around, Lena argued on behalf of the environment. The road petered and scattered until it ceased to be. We were deflated. Lena, more scared than angry, stopped the truck with a hard brake. Now what? I didn't think reminding her of the clearing was a good idea, since her foot smashed against the brake pedal was the only thing keeping us from rolling. She threw the Toyota in reverse and started a series of tight turns to angle the truck down slope. As Lena rapidly shifted back and forth, I prayed we'd be back on the road before gravity could pull us into a side roll. I held tight, knuckles white, and eyes focused forward even when something large rolled across the back seat and slammed into the window behind me. I can only assume it was our little dog Lola. Even in four-wheel drive, low gear and nursing the brakes, we still gathered a good amount of speed as we rolled back to the valley floor. The adrenaline was flowing when Lena stepped out of the truck to check the undercarriage. No leaks or obvious damage were observed. We elected not to tempt fate and instead decided to set up camp at a remote, dispersed site closer to Cedar Butte. We'd originally planned on a long day of hiking, but ended up spending the day driving through the open desert looking for a perfect place to pitch our tent. It should be noted that a volcanic bed, large enough to join opposing horizons, can make camping a difficult task. Nevertheless, we found our small plot of social distancing solitude, tucked away in a cluster of juniper wood. The ground was cleared with little effort, and the bare dirt was soft beneath our boots. After a day of dusty, stressful driving, we now stood at the foot of humble Cedar Butte and listened as the juniper boughs sighed in the desert wind. I retrieved the tent from the back of the truck and, with Lena's help, set it up for the first time. Once it was fully erect, it blistered the neutral desert landscape like a squat blue eyesore. I was slightly taken aback by its opposing presence, and I may have even been a bit embarrassed. But once the sun set behind the mountains, the tent's exterior wasn't nearly as glaring. In fact, it became a comfortable, welcoming shelter from the elements, and from what would venture in, uninvited that night, to haunt our quiet camp. Our first evening in camp was a cold one. I set about building a fire ring, small in diameter with a wall of rock roughly 8 inches high. Lena used a folding trenching shovel, a birthday gift from her mother, and began clearing an area for kitchen space. She set up the iron table and placed our Coleman stove on top. I lit the fire with small, dry juniper twigs I'd found scattered around camp, and gradually added kindling we'd brought from home. As the fire popped and crackled to life, Lola curled up on her small sleeping bag and dropped her head to her paws with a heavy sigh. I dug a polar fleece from my bag and brought one for Lena to wear as she boiled water for backpacker pantry mac and cheese. The coffee pot perked beside the simmering pot as our empty cups warmed beside the fire. It had been a long day of rough travel, but those hours of traveling bone-jolting roads were a distant memory. The camp was quiet, except the wind and the junipers, our bodies warm as we waited for a comforting meal. We followed our mac and cheese with rehydrated apple crisp, which we indulged with a little black coffee. Lola, too tired to touch her kibble, managed to accept a few cheese-covered pasta pieces we fed her by hand. Dishes done and teeth brushed, we crawled into our sleeping bags. All three of us shared a 4-inch thick camp mattress, with Lola sandwiched between the two of us. The sun had long set, and I could see my breath as the light rapidly waned. I clicked on a headlamp and started to read a Hillerman novel aloud. Beside me, Lena's hair was the only thing visible outside her sleeping bag. Lola's snout was the only thing protruding from hers. I read until my exposed hands grew numb from the cold. Assured by Lena's and Lola's deep, steady breathing, both had fallen asleep. I clicked off my headlamp and rolled to my side. Before long, I was having those vivid, fleeting dreams one has when slightly uncomfortable and vulnerable, their initial night in an unfamiliar place. The first time I awoke, my mind told me it must be just after midnight. The tent was dark, and a faint brushing of branches against it indicated the winds continued to blow. My body was very cold, and I burrowed as deep as possible before pulling the hood of my sleeping bag up around my ears. Quiet. And then a gentle scrape of juniper boughs across the nylon tent wall. A sound that repeated rhythmically. I listened to and enjoyed this natural melody until I gradually drifted off to sleep. I can't be certain how much time passed before I was abruptly awakened by a noise my subconscious told me did not fit in with our surrounding environment. I strained to listen and identify this foreign sound as I shook the grogginess from my head. I was certain what I was hearing was a whimpering child. I sat up in my bag and held my breath. Just outside our tent was the distinct sound of a young child weeping. The image that came to mind was the soft crying a child might make if lost. It broke my heart and filled me with a need to do something. I woke Lena and asked her to listen. Silence. Even Lola didn't stir. I suddenly felt a little embarrassed. Had I imagined it? Never mind, I told her. I must be dreaming. I listened for maybe 20 minutes more, but never heard the child again. Soon, I was drifting back off to sleep, shivering slightly from the penetrating cold. The next morning, Lena crawled from her sleeping bag before the sun crested Cedar Butte. I was awake, but freezing, and decided to let Lena take the lead on making our coffee. I heard the thunk and the crack of her Eastmont axe as she broke up kindling for our breakfast fire. Then the most beautiful sound of all, the rattle of our aluminum coffee pot as she balanced it on the stove. Lola still hadn't moved. A short time later, I pulled on a pair of stiff leather boots and emerged from the tent. Lena handed me a cup of black coffee, and I cradled the cup tightly in my cold hands. Lola stumbled from the tent, her eyes half shut and her gait somewhat labored. We were a haggard-looking bunch. "Sorry for waking you up last night," I said to Lena as we both took our seats in the orange and brown folding camping chairs Lena rescued from the 70s. I could have sworn I heard a small child crying. Lena thought about this and took a sip of coffee. "I heard a little girl talking," she replied. I was now eager to hear what Lena had to say and equally relieved that my experience now had some validation. She continued, "I couldn't hear what she was saying, but it was definitely a child's voice, like a toddler, almost as though she were talking on the other side of a wall." Lena said the voice emanated from just outside the northeast corner of our tent, the same direction from which the weeping came. Although I figured a cursory search around our site was futile, I did look for prints. Nothing. Not even animal prints. Our camp was so remote and isolated it was difficult to imagine anyone, much less a toddler, was walking past our tent in the middle of the night. Very strange indeed. And since I love sharing such experiences with those who believe my experiences to be true, I told Lena, well, at least I'll have a story to tell. Little did we know, this was just the beginning. After a fulfilling breakfast of fruit and oatmeal, followed by several cups of coffee, we secured our belongings in the tent and set off for Big Southern Butte. Our backpacks were loaded with the essentials. As we headed toward an old access route that once led to the communication towers atop Big Southern Butte, we discussed the events from the night before. The childlike weeping made the experience a degree more unsettling than if it had been, say, a Bigfoot following a tiptoeing deer through our campsite. Jokes. We discussed the possibility that the voices we'd heard were some historic remnant from the Goodale Trail, perhaps a small family of weary travelers crossing a sparsely treed desert and carrying little water. In 1862, the trail was used by Tim Goodale as an alternate route for guiding settlers into Boise. This proved a safer journey after the Shoshone and Bannock tribes began to resist the intrusion of westbound travelers on the Oregon Trail. Maybe these disembodied sounds from the past aren't ghostly in nature, so much as they are preserved moments in time. Our first order of business was to check the road leading to the top of Big Southern Butte. The road used to lead to a federal fire lookout years ago. The lookout has since been torn down, but Lena and I were fortunate to have visited before the lookout was reduced to a bare foundation of cracked and crumbling concrete. The view from the top is a spectacular one. On a day when the air is free of dust and smoke, one can see mountains at the foot of the Tetons in the east and the Lost River Range in the west. We continued further up the road, only to discover a great deal of snow blocking our path. Lena blew through drift after drift before deeming the driving conditions unsafe. After the previous day's incident on the opposite side of the butte, I felt her early decision to abort this mission indicated a woman who had matured after her close brush with death. Lena backed as far possible into the snowbank, then slowly, carefully, turned the truck around only to rumble and roar back down the road at high speeds. I wonder if she feels an unnecessary need to outrun disaster, even after she's clearly averted it. Having our original destination blocked by snow and ice, we opted for the exposed slope of the butte to be our lunch and coffee brewing spot. The unobstructed view from our site seemed to pour over the curvature of the earth. Scattering cattle and a few isolated volcanic cones were all that rose above the field of dormant lava. The angle of the road was so steep, Lena had to lean inside the open door of the pickup to keep from slipping. We brewed coffee in an old tin percolator and shared a jam sandwich on wheat bread. Lena snapped at Lola to quit begging, but I would hardly call it begging if I'm mindlessly throwing sticky bread crust into Lola's open mouth. We stayed on the mountain long enough to feel our skin begin to bake beneath the late afternoon sun. Our t-shirts were damp with sweat, and without the added protection of a backpack, the wind that blew across the open slope chilled us. The idea of returning to camp to build a fire and cook a warm meal was enticing. After doing the dinner dishes and dousing the campfire, we dressed in clean, warm layers and scrunched deep into our sleeping bags. We were, all three, exhausted. I thought about clicking on my headlamp and reading a little Hillerman, but my eyes were too heavy. I fell asleep to a gentle wind blowing through the sage and an even gentler whistle of Lola's nose. I hadn't moved for hours when my eyes flew open at the sound of a voice. My back and hip ached from resting in the same position, and I quietly moaned as I propped myself up on an elbow to listen. The voice originated from the side of the tent, but not a child this time. I distinctly heard a man conversing with someone. He spoke with the pitch and cadence of casual conversation. A few words, then a pause, as though waiting for a response to his question. At this point, I was fully awake and reached for my gun. I was certain an uninvited visitor was encroaching on our camp. The man continued to speak, but I couldn't make out his words. A harsh whisper shot from my mouth. "Lena." I heard her turn over in her sleeping bag. "Do you hear that?" A dim, milky light from overhead stars and a sliver of moon was all that lit the interior of our tent. Lena sat up inside her bag and listened. A murmur of a man's conversation continued to rise above the sighing wind. The juniper branch scratched softly against the tent's fabric, and I held my breath to listen, almost as if I expected the branch to suddenly snap and the tent to collapse on us. But there was nothing. Even the voice of the man had faded away. It was a relief when the sun-crested Cedar Butte and poured across our campsite, not just for its warmth, but because it causes one's fears to scatter from the light. Lola, Lena, and I emerged from the tent and began the process of making coffee and breaking camp. In some respects, our trip seemed too short. I felt we needed a few more days to isolate ourselves from the faithless banter of media icons and desperate faces staring at empty grocery shelves. When you're out in the backcountry, without another soul telling you how to live, it's more than freeing. It allows you to survive in the moment without the weight of those things you cannot change. Perhaps this is the way the settlers on the Goodale Trail felt.